Memphis, 1344 BCE. The air tasted of river silt and burnt incense. Ropes creaked against wooden posts, and a bell made of copper sounded 3 dull notes as a litter was set down. A thin smear of pitch blackened the floor where sandals had dragged. Voices rose in a near chant, then fell as if someone had cupped their hands over the noise. A young woman stepped from the litter with clay dust on her throat, and a light in her eyes that the city took as curiosity rather than a record of a life interrupted. She was called Nefret in the few notes that survive. She was roughly 19, born upstream near the marshes, and 2 seasons earlier she had been taken when a raiding party crossed a boundary and turned kin into cargo. The official record would not keep her name for long. It would list categories instead: favored, breeder, priestess candidate, expendable. What follows is not a tale of accidental cruelty, but an anatomy of a system of appetite and power that turned private desire into public policy, and, in doing so, left marks that can still be traced in graves, in ledgers, and in blood. If you want to see how ritual, law, market, and desire combined to build institutions of control that reached into bedrooms and temples alike, stay and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We will reconstruct this story through temple registers and chancellery orders, testimonies carved in potsherds, markets where people became inventory, evidence from burials and from strands of ancestry that do not forget, and the recollections of those who resisted. The chroniclists of the time wrote laws and prayers. I will read them aloud and listen for the names that the books refuse to speak. The narrative begins on a riverbank and will carry us through capture, transit, commodification, legal codification, generational servitude, resistance, and the long shadow that reached across centuries. The intention is to reveal truths hidden behind silk curtains and gilt shrines, and to restore, when possible, individual names to the ledger of history. The voices you will hear are reconstructed from fragments, but guided by a catalog of evidence and the principle that institutions do violence by design. She first appeared in an inventory book kept by a scribe named Amenemhat. His ink had faded, but the categories remained crisp. He wrote with the authority of the chancellery and invented categories of worth: beauty, fertility, obedience, ritual aptitude. Near his hand were lists of prices and destinations for a dozen people who had been moved that year. The market in Memphis was already a complex mechanism. Traders like Hapu and Kenmet, a broker named Ramu, a temple steward called Pejef, and a foreign consignor named Asher were all part of the same web. Each had a role in calculating supply and demand. Amenemhat listed taxes owed on sales and a clause that allowed the pharaoh to select from among consignments before public auctions. This clause was not a footnote, it was a key. The first rupture came during an early morning raid on a lakeside village. A single paragraph carved into a wooden tablet described the sound of drums and the metallic jingling of harnesses. Nefret remembered the smell of smoke and the taste of figs that would never be eaten in peace again. She was captured with a boy named Kemet and an older woman called T. They were bound into a coffle threaded along the back roads toward Memphis. The captors were men of several names and ranks, among them Suti the raider, Makera the guide, and a frightened youth called Penefsi who would later become a broker. The scene that followed was part humiliation and part inventory. In one exchange, Nefret asked why they were taken. Suti said it was for tribute. Penefsi said it was for work. Makera said it was for the pharaoh and then lowered his eyes. They were not asked if they consented. In the market, the transitions were surgical. The ritualized weighing of bodies happened in a courtyard where incense masked the smell of sweat. A female supervisor named Menhet inspected teeth and hair and smelled underarms as if testing oil. She touched a wrist and nodded. Ramu pronounced a starting price and Hapu adjusted based on usefulness. At the center, a temple deputy named Pejef watched because the pharaoh had the right to select. The auction did not only sell labor, it sold status and access. There were whispered arrangements between brokers and temple officials that guaranteed certain consignments for palace pleasure and others for the granaries and stables. The chancery stamped lists with words like chattel and property and recorded transfers with language normally reserved for livestock. Legal forms made the transfer clean, and the market made it routine. The logistics of movement were a machine. Coffles, barges, and litter-bearers moved people along rivers and desert tracks. There were accounts for rations, for rope, for guard wages. The record of a single shipment outlines the cost per person, sickness rates, mortality on the voyage, and the fees levied by local authorities. One remit showed loss of 4 persons to fever and a tally of 2 births in transit. The market absorbed those numbers into its accounting and recalculated prices. Where once kinship and kinplace had anchored identity, now codes and stamps did. Officials tracked provenance the way they tracked goods. In a procedural note from the Chancery, a scribe explained how consignments were to be separated by category and how those destined for temple service required a priestly recommendation. That recommendation could be purchased. Conversations in the temple precinct were delicate. In a main scene that unfolds behind closed doors, there is an exchange between 5 people that reveals the collusion of ritual and appetite. The dialogue is long and telling. The priestess Menhet spoke first. She said, "You must remember that offerings come before desires." The steward Pejef replied, "The pharaohs make offerings of many kinds, and they ask for what the temples can supply." Menhet said, "Our rituals require purity, and those chosen must fit a strict profile." Ramu said, "Profiles can be arranged by careful selection." Pejef said, "There is precedent for assigning people to service." Menhet said, "Precedent is not a justification when it costs lives." Ramu said, "Are we not all servants to the state?" The steward said, "The state has needs, and the market fulfills them." Menhet said, "Then name them what you will, but do not call it divine." Ramu said, "The pharaoh has favor, and the pharaoh has needs." Menhet said, "Favor does not erase the hands that are bound." Pejef said, "We will record this as duty and obligation." Ramu said, "We can assign safer quarters for those who please the court." Menhet said, "Safety is a brittle word when it depends on the whim of power." Pejef said, "Then write it down as a code, and we will give it force." Menhet said, "I will not sign a paper that turns people into offerings without consent." Ramu said, "Consent has never been the coin of empire." The exchange closed with a quiet that felt like negotiation and confession at once. The conversation displayed how religious language and legal frameworks interwove to produce systems that normalized control. To penetrate the market is to understand categories. There were labels for laborers and labels for those considered suitable for palace chambers. Some were described as breeders, some as artisans, some as singers and dancers, and some as priestly attendants. Prices adjusted according to youth, health, and aesthetic norms that shifted with the seasons and with the tastes of the court. Ethnonyms and foreignness were counted as premiums in some ledgers. An accounting note from the southern markets listed a high value for people from coastal enclaves because of perceived exoticism. Another record showed discounts for those marked by certain illnesses or for older people. The commodification was systemic, routinized, and justified through legal instruments. A chancellery memo explained in procedural detail that consignments should be evaluated by 3 officials, 2 scribes, and a physician before sale, and that all transfers required a stamped certificate. That legal choreography made dispossession appear bureaucratic and therefore legitimate. The law that formalized these practices did so gradually and with the language of order. One surviving decree reads like an administrative manual. It permits the seizure of persons for state service under the rubric of exceptional need and defines penalties for those who hide or resist consignments. Another law set out the rights of owners to bequeath, to sell, and to punish. The legal archive is chilling in its banality. Judges used metaphors of debt and debt repayment when discussing bodies. Appeals were rare and rarely successful. A case record recounts a petition from a woman named T who claimed wrongful capture. The verdict catalogued her appeal and then stated that the Pharaohs had precedence in times of expansion. A lawyerly tone masks the reality of coercion, and the courtrooms functioned as instruments of policy rather than as venues of justice. Nefret's past unfolded in 3 small paragraphs like strata in soil. She was born on a reed island where her mother taught her to peel papyrus and to listen for the call of the ibis. As a child, she learned to read the ribs of fish and to braid hair for festivals. Those early years taught hands that worked and an ear for stories. Her adolescence was spent apprenticed to an older aunt who made amulets and whispered ancestral names. In that time, she learned prayers and textures and how to mend torn garments until the seams might hold. The 3rd stage was rupture and loss. Her village burned, her brother was taken to a labor gang, and Nefret was swept into a world where her worth would be measured by lists. The present found her in Memphis, bound by new expectations and old knowledge, carrying a small bundle of clay beads that linked her to a family that no longer had a place to meet her. Her backstory in fuller detail fills the small gaps that official records erase and gives a human arc that connects to the structures at work. As a child, she memorized the cadence of the river and the names of the reeds. She learned to stitch a fish scale and to untie a stubborn knot. This practical education became a language of survival. In adolescence, she formed a friendship with Kemet, the fisher boy, who taught her to read small marks on broken pots. They made a pact to find one another if separated. When the raiders came, Nefret hid Kemet under mats, but the men found both. The loss shaped her actions in Memphis. Her present stance combined a quiet determination and a knowledge of rituals that later would mark her as both valuable and dangerous. These 3 paragraphs of origin give weight to her choices and make the stakes personal. There are moments when resistance appears in marginal acts. A woman in a storage yard feigned sickness until her overseer tired and left long enough for her to hide a small blade. A worker named Bayou smuggled letters between captives requesting help. A young broker named Penesi grew heartsick at what he saw, and later, after leaving the trade, assisted fugitive families to cross desert paths at night. The acts of subversion were rarely grand, but cumulatively effective. In one documented incident, a group of women poisoned a stew that was meant for an overseer who had been especially cruel. The poisoning was a desperate act, and the punishment severe. The records list executions, but they also record absenteeism, sabotage of tools, and quiet refusals to perform certain rituals. Resistance took many forms and sometimes blurred into survival. The story of selection and commodification is followed by the deeper narrative of generational servitude. Families became attached to households, children, born into service, inherited status and obligation. A ledger records 3 generations of one family with the same surname and the same duties carved out by contract. Genetics can illuminate such continuities. Recent studies of ancient remains from burial grounds near Memphis show markers consistent with endogamy within servant communities and lineages that cluster in ways that suggest restricted movement. DNA does not tell the whole story, but it corroborates the bones and the ledgers. The archaeology of neighborhoods reveals houses with small rooms, installations for work, and items that denote craft specialization. Mental and physical health consequences also appear in skeletal analyses. Signs of repetitive labor, healed fractures, and nutritional stress are visible in bones. The social inheritance of servitude produced predictable physical signatures. There are technical procedures embedded in this system that made it efficient. A chancellery manual described how consignments were to be cataloged. First, a scribe recorded name or local designation, then a physician examined for scars and disease. Then officials assigned a category with codes to be entered in triplicate. Each entry required a stamp and a witness signature to be valid before a sale could proceed. Transport was arranged through contracts that listed routes, rations, and insurance fees for loss at sea. Temple recommendations required a testifying priest and a separate seal. The procedural apparatus gave a veneer of legality to what was coercion. These details matter because they show that violence was not accidental, but organized. In the markets, the transactions were theatrical. An auctioneer called out features and prospects, and buyers circled like vultures under the sun. A young merchant named Hapu quibbled over a set of teeth, and an older buyer offered a fortune for a singer with a particular voice. The soundscape was a mixture of haggling, a bell, and the clink of metal coins. A scene at a waterfront auction features 12 exchanges among brokers, a temple representative, a buyer, and the person being selected. The dialogue moves from appraisal to bargaining to the attempt at asserting any small agency. The buyer said, "This one will sing in the palace." The temple man said, "She has ritual training." The broker said, "That increases the price." The buyer said, "Then name it." The broker said, 50 pieces. The temple man said, "The pharaoh has reserved the right to choose." The buyer said, "Then I will offer 70. The person being sold said, "I will not go." The broker said, "That is not your decision." The buyer said, "The price stands." The temple man said, "We will consult the docket." The broker said, "Money moves quickly." The buyer said, "Make haste." The person sold said, "Please remember my name." And the buyer replied, "We will call you what we must." The exchange captures the erasure of voice and the thin moments when agency tries to reassert itself. Tension peaks in several moments that were decisive. One such moment occurred when a group of captives attempted a night escape across the river. The description that survives reads of wet reeds rasping against skin, breath like smoke, and the silence of sand. Guards spotted movement and called out. A scuffle ensued, and 3 were killed. The memory of that night is compressed into 2 paragraphs of record and 3 paragraphs of lament in oral tradition. Another moment of tension unfolded when a priestess named Menhet confronted a pharaoh's steward over selections for a festival. She accused him of taking more than the law allowed and was stripped of rank. The proceedings lasted several days and ended with a public ritual that reasserted order. A third moment was a small strike by workers who refused to come to the warehouses until a broker named Panefsi intervened and arranged a ransom for their release. Each moment is between 500 and 600 characters long and shows the scale of risk undertaken by those who resisted. The political aftershocks of this system reached into propaganda and into population movements. Stories baked into song and temple myth shaped how communities remembered capture and loss. Official inscriptions glorified conquest and the pharaoh's gifts, while ignoring the mechanics that made those gifts possible. Economically, the markets created a class of intermediaries who profited from transfer and who accelerated the commodification of human beings. There were migrations away from frontier zones and pockets of depopulation documented in tax rolls. In some cases, entire villages shifted their loyalties or abandoned lands to avoid being conscripted into tribute. The terror was not simply physical, it was demographic and economic, reshaping labor and production. Resistance sometimes took the form of legal petitions. A handful of cases survive in which relatives appealed to local courts for manumission or for the return of family members. Most petitions failed, but the existence of these records proves awareness and persistent contestation. One famous petition by a woman named T argued that she had been wrongfully captured while she was pregnant and asked for recognition of her child status. The verdict reduced her to a minor notation, but the petition ceded later arguments about inheritance and legal personhood. Small defeats nested with occasional victories, and they created a legal vocabulary for disputing servitude. Names thread through this account to anchor community. Besides Nefret and Kemet, we meet T, Panefsi, Hapu, Ramu, Menhet, and Pejef. Each plays a part in the machinery, and each also gives texture to the lived world. The community around them included artisans, brokers, guards, priests, and families who relied on the cash flows from sales while resenting the human costs. A baker named Bayu hid a child for a month, and a fisherman called Suti later repented and became a mediator for fugitive families. These personal acts complicate any simple moral calculus and show how complicit roles could be both enabling and contested. Ritual underwrote much of the system. Offerings, purification rites, and festivals created schedules that required people and talents. A ceremonial performance for a pharaoh's birthday demanded singers, dancers, and attendants. The temple recorded the needs months in advance and indentured people to fulfill them. The religious vocabulary made selection sound like devotion. A funerary rite for a local noble required an offering of 10 attendants. The rituals formalized inequality by embedding it in the sacred. 3 brief moments of tension deserve fuller detail because they reveal the stakes and the consequences. The first is the night escape described above, with reeds and a scuffle and the bitter concluding silence. The second is the public stripping of Menhet that functioned as an object lesson about authority. The third is a clandestine poisoning mentioned earlier, whose aftermath prompted a series of tighter rules on food and contact. Each of these is rendered in 2 to 3 paragraphs and shows human calculation and desperation. Evidence that this structure persisted over generations is visible in burial practices. Graves of those attached to palace households often contained objects that signal status, but also items showing a life of service. A worn comb, a simple spindle, a child's toy that was never mended. In contrast, mass graves at a distance from the city show signs of forced labor and disease. DNA studies, when possible, reveal close kinship among those buried in service cemeteries and suggest restricted mobility for many centuries. The archaeology therefore corroborates the legal and textual record in a way that is hard to deny. The moral economy of this system created paradoxes. People who were enslaved could also be entrusted with rituals and placed close to power. Some served in kitchens that fed the pharaoh and attended to rituals that were declared sacred. That proximity did not equate to liberty. Instead, it made the transfer of persons more valuable and more regulated. The codebooks and the lists show that intimacy was a commodity too, and that privacy was adjudicated by market forces. At 1/3 of this narrative, we pause to reflect and to engage you. If this account has shocked you, you are not alone. Write in the comments the passage that surprised you most. Begin your comment with, "I never knew that," and tell us the detail that changed your perspective. Your responses help us locate other stories like this and guide where our research goes next. A community of readers helps reconstruct memory and ensures that these names and grievances become part of public history. Your comment is part of the archive we are building together. Now we return to the records and follow the trail of law and ledger. The chancellery records reveal language that turned people into instruments of policy. One procedural paragraph states that captives were to be registered within 3 days of arrival, and that failure to register was punishable. Another note explains how the pharaoh's household could requisition a consignment by issuing a royal seal, which bypassed normal channels. These mechanisms facilitated extraction and removed local checks on power. The law read like a technical manual and had the effect of normalizing seizure. Scenes of family life under servitude show the slow multiplication of obligation. A mother named T had a child who later became an artisan assigned to a temple storehouse. His children worked in the same complex, and the books show their names and duties across decades. The transfer of obligation from parent to child was often formalized in contracts that used language of apprenticeship and debt. The social meaning of kinship changed when children were assigned as guarantees of payment. Medical and forensic records, when available, show patterns of injury and health decline. Physicians who examined consignments recorded scars, healed fractures, and signs of malnourishment. In one account, a scribe wrote about a young woman with healed wrist fractures consistent with repetitive grinding. A physician's note explained how these signs were used to assess ability to perform tasks. Forensic details here matter because they connect bodily evidence to economic valuation. Resistance also took artistic form. Songs passed between households encoded escape routes and names of sympathetic brokers. A fragment of a lyric found scratched into a storage jar speaks of crossing the river by moonlight and the shape of reeds as a map. These creative practices preserved memory and served as tools for survival. They are small but persistent counterspeech to official narratives. 3 tension moments are revisited to emphasize consequence. The escape attempt left scars on survivors and instilled harsher punishments. Menhad stripping served as a signal that even ritual authority could be subordinated. The poisoning episode led to curfews and tighter control of food supplies. Each incident tightened the architecture of control and forced communities to adapt. Technically, the market required record-keeping, and those records survive in fragments. A merchant ledger details consignments, prices, destinations, and the fees for storage. Shipping manifests list the cost of a river passage and the mortality rates experienced during certain months. Those seem like mundane details, but they are crucial because they show planning and adaptation. A system that plans for attrition is a system that expects exploitation. The long-term impact of these practices is visible in the social memory. Stories about raids and forced service permeate songs and local myths for centuries. Museums today show objects from the period, often labeled as decorative or ritual, without mention of how many hands produced them. The absence of naming is itself a continuation of the erasure these records document. In the final months of our story, there were small shifts. A broker turned mediator, Penefsi, helped several families slip across borders and take refuge in distant villages. A priestess who had been disgraced later joined an underground network that provided false certificates for those fleeing. These acts began to change the corridors of power in a marginal way. They did not overturn the system, but they created fissures. The epilogue traces developments after the events we reconstructed and shows how the long shadow unfolded. 1 month later, the market adjusted prices to reflect recent losses, and the temporal Chancellery issued a directive tightening registration. Families held secret memorials by the river, and a small shrine made of clay beads appeared where Nefret had last been seen standing. The shrine carried offerings and the names of those who had been lost. The community's grief was private and ritualized, performed in whispers. 3 months on, a new scribe took up Amenemhat's ledger and added a marginal note questioning the practice of reserving consignments for the palace. The note did not change policy, but it recorded doubt within the bureaucracy. Farther away, a group of fugitives established a settlement that practiced communal sharing and paid tribute differently. Their existence was a challenge to the regional economy, and it attracted attention from the authorities, who sent envoys to assess whether the settlement could be absorbed or destroyed. The settlement survived by remaining small and mobile. 6 months later, the Pharaohs' court experienced a scandal when an overseer's abuses were exposed by a broker who had turned whistleblower. The scandal produced a public ritual of penance and a reform decree that claimed to limit arbitrary reassignment. The decree contained loopholes and enforcement was inconsistent, but it provided a language for future appeals. The memory of Nefret and others entered private prayers, and some families succeeded in securing partial manumissions. The long-term architecture of servitude remained intact, but small legal precedents and community memories seeded later disputes. This narrative closes with a summary and a summons. The case of Nefret is not unique. It is exemplary of how ritual prestige, legal instruments, market mechanisms, and appetite for access to power combined to produce a system that commodified bodies. The documentation is partial and fragmentary, but the patterns are clear. Texts, ledgers, burials, and genetic traces point to an architecture of suffering that was methodical and systemic. Remembering these lives is an act of justice. We restore names not to indict only, but to insist that history be complex, and that memory include those whom books have silenced. If this story moved you, join us in uncovering other voices. Subscribe to follow further investigations that combine archives, archaeology, and genetics to recover erased lives. There are more names to find and more ledgers to read. We will examine the laws that made this possible and the markets that profited from it. We will listen to songs that encode escape and to bones that refuse to be anonymous. The past has a texture and a weight. It is our responsibility to hold it carefully and to give back the names that were taken. They existed, and they deserve name.